Well, welcome to the second of the Tanner lectures to be given by Dorothy Roberts. I see this as the hearty audience who are people who are the intersection of people who are interested in ethics and who don't fear that they're water soluble. I think we're in for a really wonderful afternoon. For those of you who are at the seminar at lunchtime, it was extremely stimulating. As anyone who was here yesterday or who has the pamphlet knows, Dorothy Roberts is the 14th Penn, and I love this title, Integrates Knowledge Professor, and as opposed to our traditional academic devotee of silos professor, and the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm very interested to hear today's lecture because we are in an era when so much of the response to prior limitations in the integration of biology and the social sciences has come by simply turning the old paradigm on its head, and for people trying to show how social forces, lived experience, different kinds of illness get under the skin and influence the future behavior and capacities of a person. But this research, while I think we agreed yesterday in the discussion, is conducted by people of goodwill who generally have an ameliorative view of what the outcome will be, raises all kinds of questions that I think we'll hear some interesting discussion of about, is this reversible? Or have we succeeded in saying, no, this isn't in your genes, this was in your upbringing, but we've still made you a permanently defective individual? Is this a new reductive strategy? So when people study gene-environment interactions and they decide there's this category of lived experience called a bad upbringing or toxic stress, is that really a cause? Is it a proxy? What gets swept in? And again, are we ultimately helping the people we aim to help, or are we stigmatizing them? And again, what's interesting, and I have to say from my personal experience of having spent some time in Washington, often scientists, to emphasize how important it is that we intervene by the time, say, a child turns 3 years old, will tell policymakers that if you don't do that, then this child is lost. And this would seem to be counterproductive. And I'll be very curious to see how one can think about, again, scientists with very good intentions, sometimes also incentives to advance their careers by working on something powerful and important, might miss the mark and end up being stigmatizing reductionists. They would be horrified to hear me say that. There are also really challenging issues for anybody in research design. I mean, when you study powerful social forces, having the funds and the design to have adequate statistical power to draw a conclusion is very, very difficult. But when one makes conclusions about what is a damaging stressor or a damaging aspect of child rearing, the press, as we heard today in the seminar, really will run with this, again, thinking they're doing good, but once again, risking stigmatization. And the issue about statistical power is over conclusions that are untested, really. They're neither true nor false because nobody's really done the experiment. And this is a particular problem with many functional MRI experiments which don't really understand the heterogeneity of human beings and our complexity. And again, if one has a reductive view and studies 40 people with a certain experience and 40 controls, it's not really clear whether anything true could be learned. Nonetheless, one gets grants and writes papers by stating firm conclusions. And then the last thing, which is very problematic, and again, I want to repeat, maybe even perseverate on the fact that the motivations underlying these investigations are often very progressive and ameliorist, but nonetheless, there's a kind of creeping scientism where there's an infatuation with exotic mechanisms like epigenetics, rejecting such things as good old-fashioned learning and memory, which is part of people's lived experience, which is not to say that epigenetics isn't important. It's just that a very small number of experiments, almost all in rodents, have captured the imagination of all too many social scientists in a way that may or may not be helpful in the end or lead us toward a truth. So I have all of these questions and worries, and I hope, Dorothy, after hearing your talk, I will have a better way of thinking about these things, because I've left them all open-ended and in a troubled frame of voice so that you can help set us straight. So how's that for an unfair introduction, but welcome. And at the end, well, let's give a nice round of applause for Dorothy. And then Ann Fausto-Sterling will come up and be a discussant at
the end. Okay, I think, though, that this might be Ann's talk. Oh, I see. That's what's showing on the screen. Well, then I have to look backward at what my. Exactly. Or gymnastic one, I don't know. Yeah, but on the screen is Ann's. Okay. All right. It's not this, yeah. And I'll just look behind me to remember what my slide is. Or it could be a test of memory. Okay. And the clicker is, where's that? Is this it? Okay, great. Okay. Well, good afternoon. It's really great to be here again this afternoon to give my second lecture. Thanks again to President Faust, and Dean Minnow, who's not here tonight but introduced me yesterday, and to, of course, Homi Bhabha and the Mahindra Center and everyone there who helped coordinate this lecture series. Thanks to Evelyn Hammonds for her wonderful comments in our discussion yesterday, and Pilar Osorio for our great seminar this afternoon. And thanks in advance to Ann Fausto-Sterling for the discussion that we'll have after my lecture. So I began my first lecture yesterday asking the question, what is the relationship between biology and society? And I distinguished between two approaches that I called the old biosocial science and the new biosocial science, and the ways in which they answer this question. And I simplified the distinction I'm making between the two of them by pointing out that the old biosocial science posits that social inequality is produced by biological difference, whereas the new biosocial science posits that biological differences are produced by social inequality. And I concluded my lecture yesterday by arguing that the old biosocial science answers this question unethically in the sense that it impedes the moral value of justice. Why? I concluded by saying that the old biosocial science separates nature from nurture in order to locate the origin of social inequality in inherited traits rather than impose societal structures. It theorizes that social inequality is reproduced in the bodies, especially the wombs, of socially disadvantaged people, rather than in the reinvention of unjust ideologies and institutions. It identifies the problem stemming from social inequality as oppressed people's biological threats to society, rather than the structural impediments and state violence that are imposed upon them. And it addresses social problems by intervening in oppressed people's bodies to fix their perceived biological deficits, rather than ending the structural violence that dehumanizes them and maintains the unjust order. And borrowing from the words of James Baldwin, I concluded that it's a system of thought that makes the reality of social inequality very hard to reach. As some scientists are continuing to study the biological origins of social inequality, in other words, continuing to approach the question of the relationship between biology and society from the old biosocial perspective, there's an emerging scientific paradigm that Steve, and thank you, Steve, for your introduction, alluded to, which is investigating instead how unequal social environments produce disparate biological outcomes, how they get into the body. Rather than explain the social order as biologically determined, these scientists show how the social order gets biologically embedded. The new biosocial science has been heralded as the words like revolution and radical have been used, and they're predicted to radically change policies addressing social inequality. So in today's lecture, I want to consider whether or not the new biosocial revolution radically corrects the ethical flaws that I laid out yesterday of the old biosocial science. What is the potential for this dramatic paradigm shift to move us toward an ethical future for science by helping to transform the way we think about biology, society, and justice? And I'm not sure that I will be able to give point by point the recommendations for making sure that this paradigm shift moves us toward justice instead of away from it. I am going to spend most of my time elaborating why I'm going to point to the potential, but elaborating why it hasn't achieved the potential, and I'll conclude with some broad ways of moving forward. But I think that this is a new enterprise that we have to work on. It's not quite, there's no quick answer. What I want to do is show the potential, show the impediments to reaching the potential, and then give some ideas about how we could shape a project moving forward to reach that potential. So while the old biosocial science relies on separating nature from nurture, the new relies on merging them. The old biosocial science carefully compartmentalizes life's hereditary contributions from their environmental context. And this is true of the gene by environment interactions. It looks at the interactions, but each is separated and in fact is often quantified. How much of some phenotype is produced by environment, like literally the number, the percent, and how much is produced by heredity. The new biosocial science is exploding this boundary. There is no natural body that's born without social influence. It's impossible to isolate anyone's innate qualities from the qualities that are shaped by the social environment. Every single biological element, every single biological process in the human body is affected by society. Every cell and everything that happens to the cell is affected by society. All of life is at once biological and social. That's pretty radical compared to the old biosocial science of Francis Galton and others who followed his idea that the reason why the society is the way it is because of the inherited traits that children are born with that have not been affected by society. It's radically different. This change in perspective occurred in large part because scientists realized that the gene is not omnipotent. Not only do genes not determine social status, they don't determine anything. Scientists discovered that biochemical mechanisms govern how the genome of every cell of an organism is expressed by regulating how genes are turned on or off in response to environmental cues, without changing the structure of the genes themselves. Genetic variation doesn't cause even a fraction of differing phenotypes, whether we're talking about height or depression or intelligence. Rather, genetic variation alters responses to particular environmental signals, so it can't be measured separately from those environmental signals. Feminist physicist Evelyn Fox Keller now sees the genome as what she calls a reactive system. Similarly, neuroscientists now see the brain as a social as much as a biological organ. Like our genomes, the brain is constantly responding to environmental influences. The brain isn't hardwired either. It's plastic. It has the ability to modify itself biologically in response to social experiences throughout the lifespan. Epigenetics and social neuroscience tell us that biology isn't a separate entity that interacts with the environment. Again, to quote Evelyn Fox Keller, biology itself is constituted by those interactions. Now, what does this change in perspective mean for the relationship between biology and social inequality in particular? The environment studied by biosocial scientists includes a wide range of influences, from what you eat to the toxins you breathe, to the neighborhood you live in, to how nurturing your parents were, to the discrimination you might experience. In other words, it includes all of the social world. The social world, in turn, is ordered according to the political hierarchies of race, gender, class, and disability that structure individuals' experiences and opportunities. Even exposure to physical substances like chemical toxins is governed by social status. Think of the crisis caused by lead contamination in Flint, Michigan, that poisoned mainly low-income Black families. Using the term toxic inequality, Harvard sociologists Robert Sampson and Alex Winter, in a wonderful recent edition, latest edition of the Du Bois Review, confirm what Black activists have charged as environmental racism for decades. Predominantly Black neighborhoods comprise the vast majority of neighborhoods in the top quintile of Chicago's lead toxicity rates in each year from 1996 through 2012. Flint, Michigan, they conclude, is not an aberration. Lead poisoning of Black children, they say, is a form of biosocial stratification. So let me say a little bit more about why this new biosocial paradigm has greater potential to advance justice than the old. I see a lot of potential in it because of this radical merging of nature and nurture. Epigenetics first piqued my interest when I was writing a book on the resurgence of biological concepts of race in genomic and biomedical research. I pointed to epigenetic mechanisms to explain the social causes of racial disparities in health that have been misconstrued as originating in genetic difference. The old biosocial paradigm points to racial gaps in health as proof of genetically distinct races. At the same time, it says that they result from the existence of genetically distinct races. The new biosocial paradigm refutes this logic. It shows that race isn't a biological category that naturally produces health disparities because of innate differences. Race is a political category that has staggering biological consequences because of the impact of social inequality on people's health. Biosocial scientists are now uncovering the biological pathways through which inequities in wealth, housing, and education, along with experiences of stigma and discrimination, translate into disparate health outcomes. For example, epigenetics may explain why African Americans have higher rates of low birth weight and adult cardiovascular disease. Health disparities commonly thought to result from peculiar genetic predispositions. I showed yesterday the hypothesis from a recent study that Black race, independent of other factors, causes extreme preterm birth. Well, epigenetics provides an alternative explanation. Scientists suspect that the stress and discrimination experienced by Black mothers throughout their lives and during pregnancy cause them to have smaller babies who, partly because of epigenetic responses to the socially patterned environment in the womb, have an elevated risk of heart problems when they grow up. Now, you might excuse old biosocial scientists for being fooled by these epigenetic mechanisms they weren't aware of into seeing genetic causes that don't exist. But W.E.B. Du Bois had a new biosocial perspective when he wrote The Philadelphia Negro in 1899. This is why I say these perspectives aren't cabined by historical periods. Du Bois had a new biosocial perspective at the same time that the old biosocial perspective in eugenics was being created and developed and propagated. And he quipped, particularly Du Bois, particularly with regard to consumption, it must be remembered that Negroes are not the first people who have been claimed as its particular victims. The Irish were once thought to be doomed by that disease, but that was when Irishmen were unpopular. Freed from the preposterous belief that racial inequality is caused by innate differences in biologically distinct races, scientists can apply a more plausible biosocial framework to understand how structural racism and other forms of structural inequality produce health inequities. In addition to offering a non-hereditarian explanation for the relationship between biology and social inequality, the new biosocial science highlights the devastating corporeal consequences of an unjust social order. By theorizing innate difference as the cause of social structure, the old biosocial science portrayed socially disadvantaged people as biological threats to society. Biology then served as a justification to blame their defective bodies for social problems rather than blame society for their suffering. The new biosocial model more ethically frames biological disparities as the costs of social inequality that are unjustly borne by socially disadvantaged groups. Measuring cortisol levels of African American and Latino adolescents as they were experiencing discrimination, for example, this is where there are biomarkers that are being measured while the adolescents are noting in journals so that the scientists, the researchers can look at their cortisol levels at the time they're experiencing different things, including discrimination. And that showed that these daily microaggressions that have been dismissed by many as benign actually have biological consequences that gravely damage the health of African American youth. Neuroscientists are revealing that social and economic deprivation can negatively affect brain development. Understanding better how unequal social structures inflict biological harms can garner more concern about inequality and discrimination and facilitate more effective policies for structural change. A leading social neuroscientist explains, and this is an example, I think, of Stephen's point of the good intentions of many of these scientists, quote, "This may renew and expand our sense of societal obligation to poor children by reframing the problem as more than mere educational and economic opportunity, extending to the physical integrity of children. In other words, if the unfairness of unequal educational and economic opportunities is too nebulous to spur the public to action, perhaps seeing the physical consequences of social deprivation etched on children's bodies will. A third ethical improvement of the new biosocial science is its focus on plasticity. Unlike immutable genes that were claimed to inescapably create the unequal social order, the biological effects of social inequality are reversible. Some new biosocial scientists stress that while social inequality can have so-called durable effects on biology, durable need not equate with permanent. Because of the plasticity of the epigenome and brain structure, bodies injured at an early age by social deprivation can be helped later in life by interventions that reverse the damaging biological processes. And we can prevent these injuries from occurring in the first place ever again by ending the unjust environments that cause them. Yet the new biosocial research has not been so revolutionary in practice. The first impediment is in the research design of many studies. Their biosocial model centers on the biological fitness of socially disadvantaged people to cope with their harmful environments. Now, how do scientists arrive at this disturbing standpoint, a standpoint that's remarkably similar to the old biosocial frameworks? To fit social facts into a biological framework, some scientists convert social inequality into a series of deleterious environmental exposures. The basic research question is then formulated as, how does the body's internal chemistry respond to the research subject's exposure to adverse environmental signals? The social order already begins to fade from the model as attention is focused on biochemical responses within the body rather than on the inequitable social structures the body is responding to. Exposure to harm directs our thinking differently than infliction of harm. Our aim is no longer to understand how unequal power arrangements inflict biological injuries. Our aim is now to evaluate, in some studies, individuals' biological fitness to withstand exposure to unequal social environments. In analyzing biological fitness, some new biosocial scientists even import old biological concepts of race, gender, and class differences into their research designs when they treat some social groups as inherently more vulnerable to adverse environmental exposures than others. A 2016 study compared epigenetic biomarkers that predict aging, the so-called epigenetic clock, in seven different racial ethnic groups to explain racial gaps in mortality rates. A leading scientist in the field writes, quote, epigenetic responses are sensitive to the differences between men and women, between different social classes, and between different ethnic communities. At the same time, social neuroscientists are studying the cognitive consequences of the biological damage social deprivation does to children's brains. Using combined cognitive and neural tests, they found that the brains of poor children have a distinctive neural pattern that can impair the brain systems that govern language and executive function. Some of these neuroscientists are investigating the association between children's socioeconomic status and brain function in order to theorize the neurocognitive pathways between child poverty and lower academic achievement. Recently, neuroscientists began looking at the brain itself to detect the impact of poverty on structural brain development. Brain volume and cortical thickness can show up as amounts of brain surface gray matter in magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. A 2015 study, for example, found that children from the poorest backgrounds showed the least amount of gray matter in relevant parts of the brain and scored lowest on standardized tests. The researchers concluded that structural differences in brain development may explain 20% of the academic achievement gap of these students. Another 2015 study showed that income was logarithmically associated with brain surface area, and that's a figure from the study. These projects extend the inquiry from showing poverty's biological harms to children to explaining the biological mechanisms that make children less successful in school. A prominent neuroscience study sought to address the problem that, quote, children who grow up in poverty tend to have lower IQs and academic achievement scores and are less likely to develop basic reading and mathematics proficiency than their higher SES counterparts. So now the question is, why do children who grow up in poverty have lower test scores than wealthier children? So then they turn to the underlying neurocognitive systems that, quote, mediate the association between SES and cognitive performance, because those, quote, provide possible targets for interventions designed to reduce SES disparities. Okay, so now we're going from looking at what the impact of economic deprivation is on children's brains to explaining SES disparities by the amount of gray matter in poor children's brains. The cognitive neuroscientist who pioneered these brain development studies explained that she became interested in the topic after wondering why the children of the babysitters she hired fared so much worse than her own daughter. Although she thought they started life with the same potential as her daughter, she said, quote, somehow they found their ways onto a different kind of life trajectory toward lower achievement and fewer options in life. She speculated that poverty may have shaped the children's brains in a way that made it difficult for them to escape their mother's social status as a babysitter. A recent Newsweek article entitled How Poverty Affects the Brain reflects the shift in focus from structural to neurocognitive impediments to explain the reproduction of social status. Quote, housing discrimination against minorities living in unsafe, dilapidated buildings, implicit racial bias by teachers, malnutrition, and underfunded schools in poor communities can hamper normal brain development. All of these factors combined can make learning nearly impossible and influence why African Americans, for example, are more likely than whites to be entrapped in poverty. Like the model of epigenetically induced deficiencies, this social neuroscience model theorizes damaged brain function as the biological conduit that transfers structural inequities into lower educational achievement. But it goes further. According to this model, this biosocial process then traps poor Black children in their lower social status because it impairs the cognitive capacities that would enable them to achieve what white middle-class children achieve. In other words, if their brains function better, they would be able to do as well as white middle-class children. But all these forms of discrimination that the reporter noted, housing discrimination, implicit racial bias by teachers, malnutrition, underfunded schools, all of those directly and systematically deny opportunities to poor Black children. So what does the research on the amount of gray matter in their brain add to our understanding of how the bias of teachers, underfunded schools, why that is harmful to children's education? True, social neuroscientists reject the old biosocial view that poverty persists because poor children inherit from their parents genetic traits that predispose them to lower intelligence. But these new biosocial models can share with the old models the assumption that poor children's lower educational attainment and their resultant inability to escape poverty are determined by deficits inside their brains. For some epigenetic and neuroscience researchers, social structure is merely a backdrop for more salient questions about the biological capacities of socially disadvantaged people to respond to social inequality, though these biological capacities under the new model are shaped by social structure. But this is where many scientists, I think, take a wrong turn. They're now looking to developmental deficiencies, not structural barriers, to explain what prevents oppressed people from escaping their dehumanizing position in the unjust social order. This wrong turn is exacerbated in new biosocial models that conceive of socially induced biological deficits as heritable. Some scientists theorize that the biological harms caused by social deprivation can be passed down from generation to generation and mire individuals in the unequal social environments where they were conceived. Once researchers disconnect biological effects from their social origins, the plasticity of the brain and epigenome can turn into a stable inheritance. For many researchers, the very definition of epigenetics centers on the durability of biochemical markings that can be transmitted across generations, often referred to as long-lasting biological memories of past social exposures. Scientists are finding that stressful or traumatic experiences can have long-term detrimental effects at the cellular level as a result of epigenetic mechanisms. As I mentioned earlier, epigenetic markings in a fetus triggered by its uterine surroundings can produce health problems in adulthood. What's more, prenatal exposure to environmental factors can affect not only the fetus's lifelong health, but also that of future generations, because the epigenetic influences on the fetus will also influence that individual's future offspring. So scientists have extended the theory of inherited biochemical changes within the cells of an organism, which was the original focus of epigenetics, now to a theory of inherited biochemical changes across generations of organisms. In one model, this process occurs intergenerationally, when offspring are exposed to epigenetic influences as gametes through non-genetic factors in egg or sperm, as fetuses during gestation, or as newborns through the caretaking they receive. A more controversial and unproven model claims this process occurs transgenerationally through modification of the offspring's germline epigenome, their full set of epigenetic markings, that is then stably, the whole epigenome is stably then inherited by future generations, generation after generation, inheriting this epigenome that was influenced by some social adversity in the first generation. Many biosocial scientists go on to theorize that the biological consequences of adverse environments are not only durable, but self-sustaining. One text defines epigenetic changes as, quote, alterations in gene expression that are self-perpetuating in the absence of the original signal that caused them. Scientists have noted the implications of this concept of self-sustaining epigenetic effects for how we think about unequal social environments. One epigeneticist wrote, if, for example, long-lasting ethnic conflict, starvation, or a persistently low socioeconomic status can induce detrimental cognitive and emotional effects in members of human populations, it could aggravate and reinforce social problems for generations to come, because the epigenetic changes may lead to the reconstruction of the deleterious phenotypes. In other words, the harmful biological effects of social inequality can reconstruct themselves epigenetically, even in the absence of the social environment that originally triggered them. Social neuroscientists are developing a similar model of self-perpetuating biological harm. A leading scientist in the field told that Newsweek reporter, we're starting to get an appreciation of the richness of the social story, the social stress of poverty that's really driving these kinds of effects and shaping brain development and biological development in ways that we think are going to persist through a lifetime. This model treats the self-sustaining biological mechanisms as more significant than the original social triggers. They're what are really driving the persistence of the unequal social order. Because the biological effects continue past the social events that cause them, the present unjust social order sometimes seems to disappear into the ether. Like old biosocial scientists who confused plastic epigenomes with stable genes, some new biosocial scientists confuse current practices of discrimination, exploitation, and state violence for the self-perpetuating biological deficits of their victims. The unjust social order doesn't persist because socially disadvantaged people are biologically incapable of escaping it. It's maintained by structural forces imposed on them by people in power. Many new biosocial studies not only fail to factor this structural violence into their research design affirmatively obfuscates it. Not only have Black Americans living today been set back by a legacy of slavery and Jim Crow that lasted until the 1960s, but contemporary systems and institutions such as racial profiling by police, hyper-incarceration, employment and housing discrimination, and poor quality education and healthcare have continued to keep them in a subordinated status. All of these forces are concentrated in predominantly Black neighborhoods whose residents at the moment are subjected to government and market-backed deprivations and assaults. Many Americans were shocked to learn in 2015 that Black residents of Ferguson, Missouri were systematically and routinely arrested, charged exorbitant fines, and jailed in a deliberate scheme to fund the city government. This outrageous practice is but one component of a larger law enforcement system that criminalizes whole populations independent of their guilt or innocence in order to keep them under state control. Many of these structural forces are aimed directly at Black children. Fines, fees, and restitution mandates levied on children in the juvenile justice system in every state impose a crushing financial burden on families long after children's probation has ended. Because these monetary sanctions are most onerous for poor families, and because Black children are disproportionately targeted for juvenile justice involvement, the sanctions have created a two-tiered system of justice in which poor Black children are not only subjected to more aggressive policing, but more aggressive punishment than white middle-class children. And it's a punishment that prevents many of them from attaining the educational achievement that might give them a chance for social advancement. The Newsweek article on the neuroscience of poverty displays two large photos of students at Los Angeles high schools. In one, the one on the left, Los Angeles school police officer is taking two handcuffed students into custody for truancy. In the second, students are standing in a long line that extends outside the entrance. Now, what are they waiting? They're waiting to be scanned by a metal detector as police officers exit after what the article calls a long morning of monitoring student activity. The caption explains, quote, "Schools that can feel like prisons because of barred windows, security checks, and lockdowns increases the anxiety level of many students and can make learning nearly impossible." Okay. The neuroscience studies that the article describes suggest that the reason these children being handcuffed and standing in line all morning to go through a metal detector can't learn is their deficient brain function that results from these traumatic experiences with school surveillance. But, do I have to tell you that excessive surveillance in predominantly black schools directly prevents these children from learning because it disrupts their education, both by limiting the amount and quality of learning and by leading to higher rates of suspensions, expulsions, and detentions. A recent survey found that in schools where students of color accounted for more than half of the student body, the probability of using metal detectors, school police, security guards, lock gates, and random sweeps was 2 to 18 times greater than in schools where the white student population was more than 80%. When I looked at these images, especially the one on the right, I imagined that these students were lining up for another kind of detection and surveillance, MRIs, that neuroscientists had set up to scan their brains for the biological damage the police monitoring inflicted, and the police, in contrast, are escaping scot-free. They're nowhere in the studies. Well, except for, which I won't go into, the rising idea that you can scan people's brains to see visually racism, but I will leave that for another discussion. Because these new biosocial models, this new biosocial model converts structural violence imposed on socially disadvantaged people into their biological deficits, the remedies it generates tend to be therapies to treat their bodies and behaviors rather than actions to remove structural impediments. According to proposals by two prominent figures in the epigenetics of social inequality, research on, quote, persistent socially induced deleterious effects that reconstruct similar conditions in descendants creates an urgent need to understand how to manipulate the developmental system and neutralize or reverse those effects. Another writes, epigenetic markings are potentially reversed by pharmacological interventions. Moreover, if social environments could impact epigenetic programs in the first place, they might be reversed by behavioral intervention. He goes on to add the possibility that behavioral intervention could have biochemical consequences is extremely provocative and might be a paradigm shift in the social sciences. What's the paradigm shift? All I could imagine is that it's a shift toward intervening in the bodies and behaviors of socially disadvantaged people rather than in the unequal social conditions that some social scientists have previously targeted. So the research is directing policy a certain way, away from another policy approach. Similarly, some social neuroscientists suggest programs addressing lower academic achievement in poor neighborhoods should shift from increasing parents' incomes or enhancing children's reading skills toward more directly intervening in children's neurocognitive systems using computerized games and other strategies for strengthening executive function like paying attention. So rather than providing more resources to teach poor children how to read, they should be playing games that directly affect their executive function, which is really the reason why they're not achieving as well as children from more privileged backgrounds, according to this theory. Others are focusing on what's called coping mechanisms that will help socially disadvantaged children buffer their brains from the stresses of social deprivation. This research agenda directs policy interventions toward helping socially disadvantaged people deal better with discrimination and with police officers monitoring them and taking up their boarding as they go through metal detectors without having to address the discrimination itself. In new biosocial theories, the pathway between unequal social environments and deleterious biological outcomes often centers on mothers' bodies and behaviors in particular. Epigeneticists treat the womb as an epigenetic vector, as Sarah Richardson calls it, the conduit of past environments that are transmitted via biochemical mechanisms to the fetus. They've identified women's nutrition and stress levels and apparently smoking while pregnant as and the nurturing behavior they provide their newborns as key influences. The womb is the place where our pliable genomes are most vulnerable to environmental exposures, scientists say, where the self-sustaining loop of biochemical transmission initiates. As we saw with the old biosocial science, framing the persistence of social inequality as a reproductive process spotlights women's bodies as the sites of intervention and blame. Both epigenetics and social neuroscience conceptualize a narrow window of opportunity to intervene prenatally or immediately postnatally before children's biological capacities are set. It becomes urgent then to change mothers' behaviors for the sake of their children in order to forestall the impending biological emergency, which is then going to last generation after generation after generation. In summing up the policy direction indicated by the neuroscience of poverty, the Newsweek article suggested, quote, new programs would focus not just on the children, but also on the mother who grew up in poverty, and as a result hasn't developed coping skills and is therefore highly unlikely to be passing them on to her children. How easily responsibility jumps from economic deprivation or surveillance of children in schools or the bias of teachers, all those other structural and discriminatory problems that the article mentioned, jumps from all of that to the mother's deficient and seemingly inherited capacities which make her in need of supervision. This theory assumes that rather than being experts in coping skills because of their experiences living in poverty, poor mothers haven't developed these skills because of their own socially induced cognitive incapacities. Okay, so you might ask, well, why can't we pursue both strategies at once? Working to end the social structures that trigger detrimental biological outcomes while simultaneously alleviating the biological damage that results. I happen to notice that this year's recipients of the Heinz Award included legal scholar and activist Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, who has illuminated how mass incarceration systematically subjugates African Americans, and physician Nadine Burke Harris, who created the Center for Youth Wellness to heal the impacts of toxic stress on children growing up in poor neighborhoods. I thought that both women were admirably dedicated to using their particular expertise to tackle the causes and effects of racial injustice. By contrast, some of the biosocial mechanisms and models I've discussed, the models I'm talking about I discussed, are constructed to attribute the poor health, juvenile justice involvement, and low educational attainment of socially disadvantaged children to their self-sustaining biological deficits. Once the biological threat is located in children's bodies, it's easier to explain intervention in them as a benefit to society. One biosocial research team notes, quote, cost-benefit assessments of effective early childhood intervention for low-income children have documented significant financial returns to society through greater economic productivity, decreased welfare dependence, and lower rates of incarceration. This cost-benefit analysis shifts the moral focus from what is owed victims of structural violence to what they are costing society. The director of a child psychology research lab points out, if you talk about something being a social justice issue, it doesn't always get people's attention. But when viewed as a biomedical problem, it is literally changing and retarding biological development, and the cost of that to our society is huge. So if people can think of a biological threat that's costing society, that might get their attention in a way that concern about the cost to disadvantaged people because of social inequality and its impact on their bodies doesn't raise that much concern. Research motivated by concern about socially disadvantaged children that obscures the structural impediments and violence that denies their equal humanity and life chances risks supporting harsh policies aimed at regulating them rather than ending the structural inequities. And I know that here people will say, well, America has changed, we live in a liberal democracy, we would never see the kinds of harsh interventions like forced sterilizations that we saw under the old biosocial science. Fortunately, I pointed out yesterday, we've seen this in 2013 in California state prisons. So I don't think that argument holds much weight. It also hides the way structural forces privilege people at the top, as well as their accountability for helping to maintain an unjust social order. In his book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, Harvard sociologist Matthew Desmond points out that poverty isn't just a product of low incomes, let alone the biological capacities of poor people. He points out it's a product of the market exploitation of poor people that relies on unfair government support of wealthier people, such as housing, real estate, and tax laws that protect profiteering landlords. Not too long ago, I sat at a table with scientists discussing research on the biosocial origins of antisocial behavior in African American children, which the researchers said explained why these children were at high risk of committing crimes. One of them has merged biological and sociological perspectives to hypothesize that living in bad neighborhoods, that's the sociological component of the research, negatively affects children's cognitive functioning, that's the biological component of the research, making it harder for them to behave in socially acceptable ways and to obey the law. Now, I'm the only person at the table who isn't white, and it's extremely aggravating to be told that black children are more likely to get in trouble than their children because of black children's socially induced biological predisposition to bad behavior. Partly because I've seen their children, and also because I know something about why black children are at greater risk of being involved in the juvenile justice system. So I asked them, why don't you study white middle-class children's antisocial behavior? Because their parents won't enroll them in my study, one answers. That literally was the first response. Another explains because they don't need to be studied, the white middle-class children. Their parents have the resources to help them, so they don't need our help. And then another added, white middle-class children aren't the ones at risk of being arrested. And then they all turn to me in unison, and they look at me and say, what's wrong with studying the children who need our intervention the most, the African-American children living in segregated neighborhoods in Philadelphia? If we can use this research to develop a therapy for them to address their antisocial behavior, isn't that a good thing? Well, what's wrong is all the misapprehension in their research that makes African American children's reality harder to reach. The assumption that their studies apply an objective standard for antisocial behavior, neutral tools to identify it, and unbiased methods to measure it. That the reason African American children are more likely to be involved in the juvenile justice system is because of their higher rates of antisocial behavior. That reducing antisocial behavior in African American children will reduce significantly the racial gap in juvenile justice involvement. That developing a pharmaceutical remedy for their antisocial behavior will be more helpful than harmful to these children. And that the reason why, and I think this is the hardest assumption, the most unbearable assumption to dispense with, The reason why middle-class white children are barely involved in the juvenile system, justice system, is because of their better executive functioning. This merger of faulty social and biological assumptions makes me begin to question the growing interdisciplinary enterprise between biologists and social scientists that has accompanied the emergence of new biosocial perspectives. As I suggested at the beginning, these collaborations do hold promise for helping to transform the scientific study of biology's relationship to society. If biology was split from sociology to support the unethical view of nature as inherited apart from social influences, then perhaps reintegrating these disciplines, biology and sociology, has the potential to correct that view. On one hand, social scientific frameworks and methods by themselves can't comprehend fully the interaction between biology, society, and politics. On the other, biology is inadequate to explain the political regulation of life. So interdisciplinary engagement might help us develop a transformative way of understanding the relationship between biology, society, and justice. Biosocial science might actually contribute to envisioning and achieving human life in a humane, equitable, and just society. Yet the interdisciplinary biosocial collaborations, for the most part, have not been transformative in this way. Adding a sociological component seems to make biological research more socially relevant, while biomarkers appear to add precision to traditional sociological methods. Simply put, biology makes social science seem, well, more scientific. But this improvement has tended to reduce the social order to biological processes, reinforcing rather than contesting the flawed assumptions and blind spots of both sciences. There's a way in which, instead of breaking through assumptions by bringing together sociologists and biologists, it could do just the opposite. They reinforce each other's assumptions, which were similar to begin with. The new biosocial science, though, is an emerging field. We still have the opportunity to tap its revolutionary potential to help create an ethical future for science. How can the radical realization that social inequality is not a fact of nature, but it does have biological consequences, help put the reality of social injustice within reach? This would require a collaborative project that does more than combine biological and social variables in existing research frameworks. It would have to aim at transforming both biological and sociological thinking through open and critical exchange in order to envision a new relationship between biology, society, and justice. Transformative collaborations between biological and social scientists, first of all, have to figure out, I don't know how to do it. I think this is going to take work, but we have to figure out a way to keep unjust social structures and state violence in view and not let our gaze on biological mechanisms obscure these social realities. Is there a way to illuminate the social realities and not obscure them? Instead of self-perpetuating the biological deficit model, plasticity can give hope for positive outcomes from removing structural impediments and stopping state violence. Rather than using plasticity as a justification for intervening in the bodies of socially disadvantaged people, especially pregnant women or new mothers, a new biosocial science would use it to explore the structural transformations needed to improve life for everyone. Why not translate the plasticity of our epigenomes and brains that allow our bodies to transform themselves into imagining transformations for our social order? including lead toxicity and sociological theorizing about residential segregation, for example, led researchers to call for policies addressing landlord neglect of private housing conditions and institutional neglect of indoor environments of daycare centers and schools, and for neighborhood reinvestment and city infrastructure projects. It's doubtful that mainstream biosocial science, conceived as an interdisciplinary collaboration of biological and social scientists alone, will be able to do this work. Biosocial scientists have to collaborate with people outside of biosocial science. In the academy, that means people in the humanities as well, especially critical feminist, intersectionality, race, queer, and disability theorists. Critical theorists have pointed out long before the current biosocial trend that scientists have perceived as biological deficits. What they've perceived as biological deficits are actually products of structural injustice and often qualities that aren't deficits at all. They're just devalued for social reasons. The Combahee River Collective was a group of Black lesbian feminists who met in the 1970s, in their words, to actively struggle against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression by developing an integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that major systems of oppression are interlocking. They conceived embodiment in a more political way when they wrote in their 1977 statement, quote, "Black women have always embodied, if only in their physical manifestation, an adversary stance to white male rule, and have actively resisted its inroads upon them and their communities in both dramatic and subtle ways." In their paradigm, embodiment entails not only being exposed to adverse social environments, but also, and more importantly, being bodily positioned in a relation to unjust power arrangements, and therefore having the capacity to resist those arrangements, to understand and resist those arrangements. They understand. These are the people who understand how biology gets, or the social inequality gets embodied. Black feminists have also used speculative fiction to depict the experience of Black people in a just world in which their power, creativity, and agency, and not their pathology, rule supreme. English professor Esther Jones urges us to see Black women's science fiction, quote, not as untenable, fantastical, and absurd proxy for factual science, but rather that it be appreciated for its capacity to explore questions of social justice in realms of medicine and social policy by challenging our conceptions of human identity and behavior. Could biosocial scientists possibly turn to Black women's science fiction? Why not? We need something more to help them imagine new research models that no longer pathologize the bodies of oppressed people in lieu of dismantling unjust social structures. Achieving this vision also requires including oppressed people in biosocial research in meaningful ways, not only as the subjects of study, but also for their input in research questions, designs, and methods, and more broadly, in public debates about what's important to study. You know, we do have public debates. We have a public debate going on about gene editing. That, you know, people met in Washington, D.C. recently to think about, should we proceed with gene editing for reproductive purposes? And minds came together and hashed it out. Unfortunately, all the people that should have been at the table weren't there to be part of the debate. The people who need to be part of the debate are not just the scientists, not just patient advocates, but also people with disabilities, people from segregated communities, the people who are most likely to be disadvantaged by certain proposals for gene editing to create so-called designer babies. Achieving this vision also means that we have to include in a more meaningful way. You know, very often there's the community engagement, but it doesn't include actually incorporating into the research designs any input from people in the communities that are being engaged. Biosocial science is meant to and will have a profound impact on our understanding of how our society operates. There's no getting out of it. It's in the research models. There's no way to say what I'm talking about social is we have to proceed with science without taking it into account. These values are already embedded in the designs and the assumptions and the models. And as we see, the new biosocial science is both explicitly proposing changes in how to address social inequality, and even if it's not explicit, the results and the way that the studies are framed are being taken up into proposals for changing policies for how to address social inequality. Once in it, biological and social scientists must not only collaborate with each other in more egalitarian ways, but include critical perspectives on how to move beyond well-worn and failed frameworks to achieve a more egalitarian society. As the great science fiction author Octavia Butler wrote, there's nothing new under the sun. In a lot of ways, the old and the new biosocial science start to sound unbelievably similar, even though they started from such radically different starting points. But she says there are new suns. In striving for new suns, we might begin to envision truly new biosocial sciences that help to revolutionize not only how we see the interaction between biology and society, but how we liberate the interaction between human beings. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture. And now let me introduce our discussant, Anne Fausto-Sterling, who is the Nancy Duke Lewis Professor Emerita of Biology and Gender Studies in the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology and Biochemistry at Brown University. She's also the founder and former director of the Science and Technology Studies program at Brown and the author of works including Sex, Gender, Biology in the Social World, Sexing the Body, Gender Politics and the Construction of Sexuality and Myths of Gender, Biological Theories about Women and Men, and many, many scholarly articles. And we look forward to your comments.
Let me get this guy set up now. The people up top are going to have to, yeah. Let's go. That's not good. Go backspace. There we go. Yes, okay, and let's get rid of that. Good. So first, I want to thank Harvard University and the organizers of the Tanner Lectures for inviting me to participate in this important event. It's a great pleasure to interact with such cutting-edge scholars in the Tanner Forum. In a mere 2 lectures, Dorothy Roberts pinpoints the most important features of the current state of biological research on race and medicine. She insists that the critical analytic intervention is to focus on the ethics of social justice. And she challenges the field, including many well-intentioned biologists and sociologists, to think more carefully about what they are doing and how they should go about doing it. Indeed, she challenges all of us, collectively and individually, to figure out how to wrest the radical potential that lies in what she calls the new biosocial science from the regressive path that would reclothe the old biology and modern dress. Roberts captures the important differences between the old and the new before showing, for the bulk of her lecture today, how the new, even while making headway, is dangerously ducking for cover, avoiding the critical need to address and change the social order. For here, she argues, is where a truly ethical biosocial science could develop, but only if we understand that how it is, how it is that the questions we ask and what kind of data we gather will shape the answers we receive. Roberts writes that the new biosocial science has ethical potential because it offers an alternative to the hereditary explanation for an unjust social order. In the old social order, socially disadvantaged people appear as biological threats to the more advantaged populace. The new order frames biological disparities as the costs of social inequality and suggests that the biological effects of social inequality need not be permanent, although they may be unnervingly stable. I want to whack at this tree from a somewhat different angle than yesterday by taking as an example essential hypertension, a well-known health inequality that is supposedly naturally different in white and black and black Americans. I tend to work visually when I'm trying to figure something out, and this is definitely a category of trying to work something out. This is not a finished set of ideas. So I wanted to share with you how I visualize some of the issues that Roberts addresses, and then consider what kinds of knowledge exist and what kinds we might need in order to ensure that the new biosocial sciences move forward in a just and ethical way. Let me start by saying how I visualize what she's been talking about. We start, and most biological sciences has been focused on what I'm calling the individual system or body, and then within that is nested a series of systems that are internal to the body. So genes, regulatory networks and cells, organs, interorgan regulation leading to individual behaviors. On the whole, the biological scientists who I interact with have stayed very much focused in genes, and recently they're feeling very brave to reach out to include regulatory networks and cells. Not so many of them reach out to organs or interorgan regulation. But layered on top of this are other systems. The individual body system is embedded in what I'm calling small group and dyadic interactions. A dyadic interaction might include that, what was visualized in that photograph of the policeman arresting a couple of young people for being truant and handcuffing them. That's a small group dyadic interaction. And these, in turn, are embedded in what we can broadly call structural racism of the many kinds that Roberts has talked about today. And in turn, these are embedded in both short-term history, when we talk about what's happened from 1850 to today, and geography and evolution, and I consider evolution to be a form of long-term history. So the question is, how do we make sense or move forward developing a new biosocial science within a framework in which we have these different nested layers of organization? At what locations can socially oriented and biologically oriented researchers ask questions about embodiment that can affect social policy and structure? So I'll start here first with some work that has already exists, that is really located, I think, at this border between short-term history and long-term history and structural racism. And I think it's useful to note that there are some good models that are partial models in existence. And I want to start with the work briefly of Nancy Krieger. who has, I think, pioneered research in this area through the mechanisms of public health research. And so one of the questions she poses in an article that was published in 2012 is at the level of societal history, and she asks, what are the historical trends in an embodied biomarker or outcome, that is, within countries or regions, and in relation to social divisions such as power, resources, and discrimination. And what I want to show in the next slide is not so much about the actual biomarker she's looking at, but the ways in which she's tried to take apart the social experience in which we might want to look at how biomarkers vary. And I've redrawn this from a study she did, which was basically an interview study of where people experienced discrimination. So in the center we have experiences of discrimination, and she's started to break these up among people who have the different categories: Black, Latino, born outside the U.S., female, age, education, social desirability. These are all categories we began to discuss at the seminar today that certainly need to get integrated into any kind of story. But I think importantly, she also divided up, and these aren't the ultimate divisions, but they are a reasonable set of divisions, the locations where people encounter experiences of discrimination. And she tried to measure how frequently these different locations appeared in the discussions from different groups of people, in order to see ultimately where there might be the most effective places of attack to lessen the experiences of discrimination. So we have clearly school, work, housing, medical care, store services, credit loans, public settings, police and courts. These are all social locations where people experience discrimination and where their individual biological systems have responses to their experiences. And then one of my favorite graphs, some of you will certainly be familiar with this, which is an example in which we can use international data to get right to the heart of something. And this is an older graph from Richard Cooper's 2005 study, in which he looked at the prevalence of hypertension in different groups. And recall that the going paradigm within U.S. medicine is that African Americans have much higher hypertension for some innate reason, and in fact, it's called essential hypertension. That is, there's no obvious cause for it, it's just there. But when he looks at the levels of hypertension, and he includes U.S. whites and U.S. blacks, and indeed there is pretty high hypertension, but he compares U.S. whites to, say, Africans from Nigeria, or Jamaicans, they are much closer to U.S. whites, and the group with the highest level of essential hypertension are white people who live in Germany. So in one graph that includes comparative international work, he essentially destroys the argument of essential hypertension. And that's the kind of research that happens at that border between social history and geography and the next level down of structural racism. So these are just examples of places that we can work and fruitfully gather information. So back to this graph, if we look now here at this level of individual body systems and small group dyadic interactions, I want to introduce some biological work that gives a rather different focus on how the body works than the standard one you see here, where the argument is you start with genes and you build everything up from them. And this will be working both at this individual borderline and the borderline between small groups and structural racism. So Krieger asks a second question in this paper in which he insists that we need to be looking at the full course of life histories, of individual life histories. And she asks, how does a marker or a disease develop and change over the course of an individual life? Do life history patterns vary with societal history and geography as laid out in question 1? And to get a look at this, I want to introduce the traditional idea of physiology and how it works, and then a newer idea, which actually has been in the literature since the late 60s, but I think has great currency at the moment, the idea of allostasis. And homeostasis is the standard idea that our bodies always want to reach a neutral resting point, and that something can happen that can knock them away from that resting point, and then they return to that resting point. And homeostasis essentially provides a snapshot of what a healthy body is supposed to look like. Allostasis, on the other hand, suggests that what's critical is that the body is controlled both by immediate effects from, say, hormones, stress hormones from an immediate incident, but that the hormonal responses are in turn governed by the memory of prior experience, so that there's an upper level governing that works through the brain, and that can predict. So prior knowledge leads to prediction. So in allostasis describes mechanisms that change the controlled variable. In this case, I'm talking about blood pressure, by predicting what level will be needed and overriding local feedback to meet anticipated demand. So memory is involved, the brain control is involved at the level, and then lower level immediate responses are involved. So the homeostasis model cannot explain essential hypertension because it attributes all pathology to a defect or to something being broken. The allostasis model proposes that hypertension emerges as a concerted response to the prediction of a need for vigilance. When this prediction is sustained, all the effectors, both somatic and neural, adapt progressively to life at high pressure. And thus, higher blood pressure becomes the normal status of the body. So when does vigilance begin? Getting back to Krieger's insistence that we need to look throughout life history, these are 30 or 40-year-old data now, but they show increasing blood pressure just with normal age. And what you see is that in boys and girls both, blood pressure it's quite low and stable in the first 4 or 5 years of life, and it begins to increase as kids start to go to school. And this probably would look a little different today because kids are going to school at younger ages, but the period from which these data came suggests that. So as kids leave a protected situation and they begin to have to engage in small group interactions in settings like schools, their blood pressures increase. And so another thing that we need to understand is sort of what is the normal life course of something like blood pressure. It isn't just a thing you're born with, it's a process that develops throughout the life cycle. These are all causes of high blood pressure. And what you see here are the immediate things that lead to it: cardiac output, how thickened your blood vessels are, blood volume, all of the different hormones that go into affecting these things. And down at the bottom here, we have the brain, which is the source of the prior knowledge and prediction. So the brain, this is kind of a hierarchical model of blood pressure, but the brain in the end sends signals that help to control all of this intermediate physiology that maintains blood pressure or causes it to spike. Again, when demand persists, all the mechanisms are reset to operate at a new level. We can look also at blood pressure as 24-hour cycles, and we can see how normal, and when we do that, see how normal and essential hypertension differ from one another. In a normal 24-hour cycle, this is showing here, say, an undergraduate at a lecture, and they start to doze off here, and their blood pressure goes down, and then someone jabs them with a pin, and their blood pressure spikes, and then it goes back down in here. They might have sex late in the day, and their blood pressure spikes again. and then it goes down as they sleep to a low level. But then when they wake up, it might go up again as they're starting to cope with the start of a new day. That's a normal 24-hour cycle. So blood pressure isn't a static thing, but it's responding to the events of the day. In essential hypertension, though, and these scales are roughly the same, you can see, first of all, that the whole scale is elevated up so that you have higher blood pressure all day long. And even during sleep, the level of blood pressure is up here around 140, as opposed to where it would be around 80 in sleep in normal. So you see this enormously elevated pattern that seems to be less responsive to the daily ups and downs of life. So low-level treatments won't work for essential hypertension. You have standard drug treatments, for example, are diuretics to reduce blood volume, and they affect, this is a low-level place that treatment is given, and it doesn't work particularly well. Vasoconstrictor antagonists, which dilate vessels, work here to affect the vascular reservoir. Also, they don't work very well, but these are treatments that are given. And then heart rate antagonists to reduce cardiac output are given also. And the fact is that we know that none of these work very well, that within they may have an immediate short-term effect, but within a very short period of time, what happens is that the brain starts saying, no, I anticipate I need much more, and I'm going to override whatever you're trying to settle down with these pills. So the brain is still anticipating prior experiences that want the body to be at a level of high alert. So what does work? This is going to sound like kind of simplistic, and it is at one level, but it's not really if you think about it more carefully. So you want to reduce stress and reprogram what the brain anticipates, and the question is, how do you do that? There are some standard things that are used that do work, in fact, over time. Weight loss, exercise, moderating alcohol consumption, eliminating tobacco consumption, a diet reduced in sodium, fat, and increased fiber. These are all actually difficult solutions for any one individual under high stress to take. And that's, and there's a number of reasons for that, see smoking. But these things do work, but they only work if you provide a social context for them to work in. So successful interventions satisfy a sense of social need by enlarging positive social interactions and revivifying a sense of connectedness. And I'll talk about how that might be. In the case of, for example, in the case of coronary heart disease, when patients combine diet and exercise in a group context with a charismatic leader, atherosclerotic plaques regressed over a year. So this is a slower term reprogramming of the body, but it can only happen to begin with in a situation where there is a small group interactions and supports. So this is the sort of near-term thing. And of course, we've seen these. There are other examples of therapeutic communities, such as 12-step programs for treating addiction to alcohol and various drugs. These are the small level, but they require at least moving away from the individual to this an area of small group interactions. And certainly, what they say is that the drugs aimed at these near level causes are not going to be where you want to go. So, what are some of the bigger starting points that reduce the need for vigilance and to also restore small satisfactions? Because the other part of this is that the brain is seeking pleasure. It wants a little shot of dopamine, which might come from eating French fries. If it doesn't get it somewhere else. It wants some pleasure in daily life. It wants community. How how can we, and these are the things that reduce the need for vigilance. If you want to reduce the expectation that you're going to be challenged in various ways by when you walk into a department store, all of these kinds of things are middle-level interventions. So first of all, there are the elephants in the room, which Dorothy Roberts has already named pretty clearly. We need to address the experiences of discrimination as outlined by Krieger. These are the daily experiences that people encounter. We need to address police, court, and community violence in order to reduce the need for vigilance. And these are the big things. These are the big picture things. And I totally agree that in planning research projects that begin to look at both the biology and the social together, that we have to have community activists involved in planning these, in planning what a project should look like. And these are, the elephants are the reason why. But there are smaller, lower level changes also that can have positive health effects and actually can relate to achieving some of the big changes that are needed. They aren't the way to achieve them, but they have a role that if done radically, I think could be important. So here's some simple things. Make life more habitable by doing things like building more parks, providing communal opportunities to garden, get fresh food into food desert communities. I mean, if we're saying that we want people to eat well and properly, food has to be available. And what more pleasurable way, from my point of view, to get food than to grow it yourself? I know some of you know I'm a big gardener, but the point is that these are things that can also reach back into traditions that are in people's histories that can be part of reconstructing community. We need to enhance opportunities to walk, to exercise, cycle by restricting automobile traffic. And one of the things we need to do if we restrict automobile traffic is improve public transportation. That has a side effect of also allowing people to get to work and maybe holding jobs outside of their community. So these are factors which are part of what you'd have to do to really intervene socially in order to change that notion of essential hypertension. And the same for providing exercise community, exercise facilities, the kinds of things you want in neighborhoods that used to be available and aren't in a lot of neighborhoods. And finally, and not necessarily in decreasing order, you want to improve work by acknowledging that no human can be satisfied by performing an unvarying task for 8 hours a day without vacation, without intervention. So these are starting points that need to be addressed for reducing the need for vigilance and for restoring what allostatic theorists call small satisfactions. If we then return to this graph or this diagram, we see that we're talking about looking at here. And here, again, just to review where we're talking about. And so then the question is, how do we do work in these areas while engaging the scientists who are really interested in the individual body systems? And I don't have the answers to that. I agree with Dorothy, we're at a moment of opportunity where maybe we could do this constructively. When we think that most of the scientists who are working on individual body systems really just want to study the genes or now their regulatory networks. So how do we engage scientists in a way that can give them the opportunity to study what interests them, but in a way that really does embrace the kind of social justice ethic that Professor Roberts suggests, argues we need. So here, these are just the forward-looking questions that I'll close with. What kinds of interdisciplinary knowledge projects can we design that save the new biosocial science from collapsing back into the old biodeterminist science? And what are the interesting biological and sociological questions that might encourage biologists and social scientists to collaborate in knowledge projects that embrace the ethics of social justice? I think, can such knowledge projects then promote political and structural change? So I think that these are the questions which Professor Roberts has posed, and which in this forum we can't gain answers to, but I think could be the project of the next couple of years to try to engage people from these different walks of life in discussions to talk about what would a constructive research project look like? What would be the questions that would be interesting to physiologists, but also interesting to social scientists? So I will stop with that. I'll try.
What a really interesting 2 days. So before I ask for questions, I was wondering whether you had any thoughts or responses to Anne's discussion.
Yeah. I was very grateful for Anne's suggestion of some concrete ways that we can begin to think about biosocial science in new ways. And, you know, as I was listening to what you said about hypertension, what you were saying is, here's what the evidence shows us would actually reduce hypertension. And all you're suggesting, and I think I'm suggesting, let's work on projects that actually will help reduce social inequality. You showed us evidence that what a lot of scientists are looking at, if they're looking at race-specific genetic difference to try to address the reason why African Americans have higher rates of hypertension, we've got the work of Richard Cooper that shows, and many other people, other people that shows that's not going to do it. You know, let's look for a pharmaceutical remedy. You showed that's not going to do it. And then your suggestions are the kinds of things I was thinking of at the end when I said, could we use this to figure out ways that would make life better for everybody? You know, parks and good food and gardens and things like that. And I think a response might be, oh, that's so unrealistic. But why? Why is it? It's not as if we're saying, right now, change the world. You know, end racism, end classism, end discrimination. No, there are actually concrete things that we could be doing that wouldn't cost any more than the other, it certainly wouldn't cost any more than all the money that's been spent looking for those race-specific genes. You know? And so, and even if it did, if it will solve the problem, why not do it? I guess my reaction to what you were saying is, yes, this makes sense. What are the barriers that prevent scientists working together with people in communities to come up with better solutions for the problems that they have been working on? And so I really appreciated your approach.
I'm glad.
Yeah,
because, I mean, I have to say that I also, reading the logic of your paper, and it is overwhelming to think, well, yeah, we got to fix the police system and we got to get rid of structural racism, and
Yeah.
And so, but that, starting at that level of complexity and that level of sort of entrenched power, it stops most people in their tracks. So the question is, can we start a little more gently?
Right.
And I honestly, actually, I believe if you had developed community projects of certain sources, you would have an impact on things like community police relations.
Yeah. Yeah, I also appreciated at the end your suggestion of working collaboratively on particular projects, so that projects that can be useful to addressing the kinds of problems that that many of these scientists are trying to address. I think sometimes when we think about interdisciplinary projects, and I expanded it beyond biologists and sociologists or biological scientists and social scientists to including people in the humanities and even science fiction. Thinking about that also seems overwhelming, but if you think about particular concrete projects and what the role could be of each of these disciplines and perspectives, it's easier, I think, to be able to imagine how it could actually go forth. Yeah, so I appreciated that also.
Good.
Okay, so let's, why don't we invite some questions? So, Arthur.
Well, I thought this was great tonight, and I
Thank you.
respond specifically to the thing that just happened around the Anne's presentation of how does interdisciplinary colloquy effectively occur that would in some way have the kind of impact that you're asking for. Admittedly, it's a huge impact.
Yeah.
Let me just say that most interdisciplinary colloquy has been, from an intellectual standpoint, pathetic. And pathetic largely because, and illustrated in the two talks, because it's associated with relating social variables and biological variables. And it doesn't engage the deep theoretical issues underlying both. And I thought Anne was trying to get at that very much. So when we see anthropologists working at this, they're caught up on the fact that for biological anthropologists, there's only one big theoretical position, and that's evolution. And for social anthropologists, it is impossible to work only with the idea of evolution. But if you look across more broadly at work that's been done, this kind of thinness of theory is very well seen in the stress social support area, which after all has been the implicit fallback position for most people working on this, in this area. And indeed, even with bringing in ideas of bioaffiliation, that is the way it goes. And so and another one which is, I think, reasonable, but doesn't get us all that far, is Bob Merton's unintended consequences of purposive action, which is more or less what you talked about yesterday. So what are the ways that we could move forward? And here I really appreciated the allostasis. Now, the allostasis idea really goes back to Georges Canquième, who was Foucault's teacher and was both a physician and a historian. And Canquième believed that the central question for medicine was, how do norms and normality relate to each other? Especially since he knew that norms were coming into the body, and that normality was not just limited to a single body. And I think this has been raised very much with the allostasis. I think that idea of upregulation, as opposed to the pathological view, always that something is broken, is extremely important and has to be taken very seriously theoretically. But on the social science side, I want to suggest another idea, which comes out of, again, of anthropology. And that's the idea that what we live in are not just networks and not just communities, they're local moral worlds. Now, why are they moral? Because there are deep things at stake for us in those local worlds. Our finances, our status, our sense of self, our need to protect others and to develop them, develop ourselves. And this leads to my question for you, Dr. Roberts, which is, Yes, we want to ultimately work with at the ethical level of principle, with that central principle for you and for us of social justice, okay? But social science suggests that on the empirical level of the way people live their lives, there is a thing called moral experience. That is, those values that we feel that if we're pushed up against the wall, this is what really matters to us. And often those values are in conflict in the world, fitting in with your ideas of bias and discrimination, of people who feel that the local world's consensus on values is not the values that I'm holding or that my small group holds.
Yeah.
And so I would suggest that if this is going to be an intellectually serious enterprise that is welcoming to a broad set of scholars and will lead somewhere, that in each of these domains we tie it to theory. Not theory for its own sake, but theory that organizes empirical research. And that theory has to be serious on the biological side, on the social side, and on the ethical side.
I agree with that.
I absolutely agree. And I think my suggestion at the end that biologists and sociologists would do well to include more critical disciplines like feminism, disability studies, critical race theory. Part of that was to push toward a more theoretical analysis and rethinking about their collaborations with each other, because, as I said, there's so often it ends up being reduced to supporting each other's prior assumptions instead of critically engaging each other to contest those assumptions, and sometimes having yet another set of perspectives in the discussion might help that move forward. But I absolutely agree. It cannot be just adding a different kind of variable to an existing framework. It has to be a more profound and robust rethinking of theoretically of the of what the questions are, what the purpose is of the research.
So we had a question in the back.
Yeah. Oh, hello. My name is Leslie Wilson, and I go to Dartmouth Med School, but I'm focusing on biostats. But it's like so amazing to hear you talk. It took me like 4 hours to get here, and totally worth it.
Wow.
Because what I'm doing, and I think you're really gonna think it's awesome, is I'm running a pilot study on this exact sort of thing. Because we get students coming into sort of this Ivy League environment. It's kind of a closed environment, and sometimes they don't adjust too well for whatever reason because it's such a insulated environment. And so basically, like me and a couple of other people are talking to faculty, talking to incoming students, and we're trying to create something similar to an ethics committee, except specifically to like help with that sort of situation so that it makes the whole process easier. I don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense right now. Anyway.
I'm not sure what the ethics committee does.
Well, did you want to phrase a question to?
Well, yeah,
I
guess my question is, do you see sort of similar studies like this occurring, sort of like, as you were saying, applying empirical action to these things in a focused way, sort of like what we were considering doing?
Yeah, I think that I'm not sure if I understood completely what the ethics committee is, what the role is, but I think that, again, projects that are trying to solve a problem and bringing people together to figure out how to solve the problem from various perspectives and disciplines and from inside academia, outside academia, bringing all the people we've all mentioned, the different components of being interdisciplinary and community engaged and all of that to solve a problem that is going to improve people's lives is the way to do it. I don't, now, as Dr. Hyman was saying, I don't, asking questions in terms of the principles of ethics isn't always the best way to do it, because it, as you were saying, it assumes often assumes a universal meaning of ethical principles, and often applies them in a very theoretical way that doesn't have real application to people's lives. They often don't. There's often a way to get around them, as I mentioned with the sterilization of women in California state prisons. Well, they got around it partly by not getting ethics approval, but also the doctor was able to rationalize performing these sterilizations.
He knew it was ethical.
Exactly. So there are, I think we also have to think about how ethical principles apply to science. And one thing I was trying to do in my lectures is to think about a more, a deeper way of thinking about justice that takes into account both structural barriers to people's equal humanity in the way they're treated in society, but also can be the basis for real changes. And the way in which ethical principles are applied doesn't always do that. So again, I'm not sure, that's not to say that your ethical committee isn't, I'm not sure what it's going to do, and that I'm not disagreeing with it. I'm just saying that I think we need both, in all the issues we're talking about, a rethinking about how these values and ways of thinking and approaches and methods and assumptions and research questions and all of it can actually improve people's lives, reduce structural inequities, and not rationalize maintaining things the way they are.
So, Professor Baba.
Thank you. Hi.
It's hard, it feels like we're being interrogated.
I know. It's hard to see, but.
Well, thank you
lights.
very much.
The lights are bad.
Thank you very much for your talk. This is the kind of unreconstructed humanistic question about the about the historical model on which the new biosocial science works. Mm-hmm. Because you talk about the social order being embedded in the body, mm-hmm. and the way it's embedded or mediated mm-hmm.
is
a historical, it has a time dimension to it. It's a form of historical causality.
Yes.
And you
Yes.
mentioned two aspects of that,
Mm-hmm.
long-lasting biological memories
Mm-hmm.
and intergenerational hereditary,
Yes.
epigenetic.
And transgenic.
And trans,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
So time is not simply a background here to events happening or to knowledge being built up. It's absolutely intricately involved
Yes.
in the question of causality, into how these mediations take place.
Yes.
So social orders have different temporalities. Different institutions don't work with the same temporality in constructing either experience or in constructing knowledge.
Yes.
So I'm interested in this aspect, which I felt was not clear to me at least, as how this mediation takes place and how does the new biosocial science construct a sense of its own historical causality.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is the history within it, and how does it see that history while it's embedding social institutions which are very diachronic historical models, you know? The tax system works very differently from the medical system, and even within the medical system, you know, hypertension has a different kind of sense of causality than disabilities of other kinds. So this is a complex question about time and causality, but one that concerns and worries me because I didn't hear it.
Well, it worries me the way in which some epigeneticists are treating the question of time. Two aspects of it that I touched on were seeing the current effects of unjust social conditions as being produced somewhere in the past. So, and I don't think this is theorized very well in the new biosocial research. The idea that the biological mechanisms are self-perpetuating, so it raises the question, well, where did this loop of self-perpetuating epigenetic mechanisms begin? That's not clearly stated in the research. And then, because you could say, if you see the epigenetic markings, where exactly did they start? If it's true that, and it hasn't been proven yet, that these
It's not
can
true.
be, you know, I know. Okay.
Neo-Lamarckian
But-
poppycock.
Okay,
yeah.
but I'm just saying, if it's true, according
Yeah,
to the theories, if it's true, presumably what we're seeing now could have happened 1,000 years ago and be, you know, passed down.
Yeah.
Now, what are
The Greek gods did it.
Exactly. What are the implications of that? One implication is, well, it's not the current institutions that are doing it. We can blame it on past institutions. And this, that has obvious effects on how we see what action needs to be taken. That supports the idea that the only way we can intervene is to intervene directly into the mechanism somehow through pharmaceuticals or behavioral interventions to try to alleviate some of these effects, but it takes the focus off of the current ways in which, and the myriad ways, as you're pointing out, there's a lot, you know, this is complicated, there are lots of ways. So that's one. The other is that currently there's only this narrow window to act. And so even the time frame is important, because if you don't intervene in the fetus or in the newborn, then this window of opportunity of plasticity is going to close.
Supposedly.
And it's supposedly. All this is all a model. That's the point. It's all the way it's being approached. That's why there is the possibility of changing these models. They're just models. So that also has the effect of focusing attention, especially on pregnant women and new mothers, because they're the ones that have control, that, you know, some influence over this narrow window of time.
Right, the crack baby epidemic was the apotheosis of that. That's why you have to arrest pregnant mothers and incarcerate them.
But you see, that was, as I pointed out, that's the old biosocial model.
No,
If you think about the new biosocial, then incorporates a very similar model because of their view of these time frames that are very, very much apart. That's why I pointed out for some people, the very definition of epigenetics hinges on a view of time.
Yeah.
Hinges on a view of time. As you asked your question, now this may seem unconnected, but I think it's very much connected. It reminds me of the way in which in the old biosocial science, theories about the way in which separate races evolved hinge on some historical period in human evolution where, after the migration from Africa, so at some point, populations left and settled on different continents with enough time to evolve into separate races, but before there was any interaction between. So it couldn't have been when there were ways to cross they crossed the ocean, the migration, but for some reason they couldn't have gone back and forth, although we now know they did. There was a migration back from Europe into Africa. But it's this time frame, this period of human evolution. I have yet to read any, I don't know, Pilar, if you know, but I've yet to read any of these accounts that specify when did this happen? And it's just this imaginary period that's so ambiguous. And it's a similar kind of process in these models where there's no specificity to either the events or the time frame that supposedly creates these now self-perpetuating processes of biological deficiency.
And that's why I asked the question, because I think the collusion between the old biosocial science and the new biosocial science, one of the measures of that collusion is a shared form of historicism of this kind.
Yes.
And I think that's why these new vocabularies bring forth old forms of knowledge and somehow hold hands at some point. That's why I actually raised the question.
Yes.
So, Professor Baba, even through my now nearly incinerated retinas, I see 5 or 6 questions, and it grows late. So how much temporality do we have on our side?
I would say you have another 20 minutes of time.
All right. So, Stephen, you've been...
Then it's traumatic.
Yeah. Very patient. Yeah. The man in the yellow...
Sorry.
Yeah. Coat.
Thank you very much. And both the presentations were really enlightening. I'm going to try to keep questions extremely brief. I just have a factual question for you. On that temporal chart of hypertension, why would post-war Germany rank where it
so
did?
high.
Because of all those stressors that you listed, it seems to be performing pretty well on diet and exercise and urbanism and all the things that seem to... That's a short factual question, but I do have a deeper question for Professor Roberts.
So I don't have a good answer for that, but I think that when we choose not to use knowledge systems that work at that level of international comparison, then that's a question that doesn't get asked. So there's some. Right. So what's going on in Germany to lead to those high levels of hypertension, whether it's fat in the diet or stress or whatever.
And then you look at
but it's a question that doesn't get addressed because we're so focused on this notion that there is this essential hypertension that's some inherent difference between Black Americans and white Americans.
Got it. So my question to you, obviously the new biosocial science is very compelling. I'm Stephen Marks. I'm a professor of health and human rights here. And given my professional orientation, obviously the human rights framework provides an orientation towards the social justice grounding for many types of disparities and injustices that occur. And the moral requirement on somebody like me to take into account interlocking systems of oppression is sort of self-evident. But I also sit on the Committee on Scientific Freedom and Responsibility of the AAAS. And we are in the process of updating a statement on scientific freedom and responsibility. And as we formulate that, there is a moment at which you're sort of suggesting that research in these areas that does not take the approach of new biosocial science and does not acknowledge the structural bases for oppression is unethical. Now, is there a point at which we take that literally? Certainly, in general, morally, I agree, I'm on board, I fully support it, but at what point is there a place where you can draw a line on actual scientific research that is unethical? And I think of your white colleagues around that table, when they kind of naively asked you, well, why not? We're just trying to improve things. Come on. They weren't actually being unethical, you were saying. But so is there a line that you want to draw? Where would you draw it?
Well, okay, so your question raises a lot of other questions. One is there a difference between being unethical and not pursuing moral values in your research? So and that goes a little bit to what I was saying. I think she left now, but the question about ethical principles and how they operate with respect to research. There's a deeper question, I think, about the relationship between research and moral values, and whether the way to shape research and steer research toward promoting what we think are important moral values. Whoever's deciding this, and the one I focused on was justice. If the way we do that is through a set of ethical principles, or if we do it some other way. So, in other words, I'm not saying that this research violates a set of principles and therefore there should be some consequence. I'm looking more broadly at how the moral value of justice is embedded in everything that scientists do. So it would be hard to say, to take what I said and say, well, that violates a principle, therefore you can't do it. First of all, the ethical principles, the way they operate, really don't even get at half of what I was saying. They apply to a very limited set of questions, like how you treat research subjects. They really don't go to these deeper questions of how the research design is structured in order to further justice or not further justice. So even though I called my talk the ethics of biosocial science, I refer to ethics, that was in part to push forward a broader way of thinking about ethics. I used it deliberately to question what we call ethics to begin with. I said a little bit about that during my first lecture. One of my colleagues said to me, well, you can't call the old biosocial science unethical because there were no ethical principles at the time that it began. So, the ethical principles that came out of World War II, you cannot now judge eugenicists from prior to that by those standards because the principles didn't exist. And that's why I said at the beginning of my talk, I'm not talking about judging this science by a set of principles that may have been promulgated on a particular date, and from henceforth, whatever violates it is unethical, but before then, we can't. I'm judging it by, did this science promote or hinder social justice? Okay, so that's, what do we mean by ethics? What is the role of principles in determining that? So that's one, determining what is ethical science or unethical science. And I was not trying to apply a set of principles to determine whether or not science was unethical, a set written out set of principles. It was more the norm. Okay, but then you raise another question, which is also very knotty. It's the question of, can there be some restriction on science because it's considered to violate some moral norm? And so with the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki and the Belmont Report, there was the decision that there are some scientific practices that should be forbidden. You shouldn't be able to experiment on incarcerated people because they're locked up. just simple things like that. You shouldn't be able to select people because of their social position and without informed consent perform surgery on them. You know, so I mean, we would agree that there are certain practices that should be forbidden. In fact, if other people, rather than scientists, did them, they'd be considered crimes. Okay, right? Okay, so that's true. Now, then we get into this area that is accepted science, that where it's more controversial whether or not it even violates moral norms because it's accepted. Okay, and when it gets to that area, then people begin to say, well, we shouldn't even scrutinize it because then we're at risk of unfairly or unjustly or unwisely restricting science. And I think now with gene editing, this question has been opened again. Are there forms of science that should be prohibited? Should we prohibit gene editing for reproductive purposes? So at least the question is on the table whether we should or not. I understand the danger of governments prohibiting certain forms of science. And I think we, in generally, should support freedom of scientists to do their research, but we also have to recognize that scientists have a great influence on the way we think in our society and how we approach important questions like social inequality. And so they shouldn't be free from scrutiny. And we also have to recognize that those values are already embedded in science. Plus, we also have to recognize that a lot of public resources go into funding certain types of science and not other types of science. So we don't even have to get to the question of prohibiting science to have a debate about, an open public debate with lots of people involved from lots of walks of life and disciplines and all of that, whether or not public resources should be devoted to certain types of science that have been shown to perpetuate social inequality. So there's that as well. I think there's a lot we can do before we get to the point of saying we should ban people from engaging in certain kinds of scientific inquiry, even though we can all agree that there are certain forms that should be prohibited. I think I'm much more open to saying we should scrutinize science and think about where our public resources should be placed, because I'm very aware of the way in which science is already politically influenced and already has these different values embedded in it.
This is a really important point, but
Yes,
want
okay.
to let Evelyn and Professor Hammond, Professor Bobo, very patient people waiting here in the center. Oh, absolutely. Hey, Pilar.
So I think, we're going to get into sort of a bit of a kind of conundrum if we don't really articulate, the ways in which ethics is manifested through scientific practices. Mm-hmm. There are ethics that are manifested. Mm-hmm. And so rather than think about the old biosocial and the new biosocial, I think one of the, as different, and sometimes the new recuperates some of the old, but the thing that they share fundamentally is, if we're talking about the U.S., they both occurred in the context of racially stratified societies. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's very easy for us to look back and say the architects of academic biology in the early 20th century lynched their fortunes to eugenics because they had a sense that that was a way to gain status and authority, but they recognized it was a racially stratified society and that it was gendered in particular ways. They didn't see anything wrong with it.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
There are biosocial scientists today who don't think we are still in a racially stratified society.
Yeah.
And they don't see, so therefore, we can now dispassionately look at some of these problems at the level of the gene, because this whole issue of a racially stratified society is not on the table anymore.
Yeah.
But it's still a racially stratified society.
Yes.
And that's the context in which both the old biosocial worked in,
Yes.
and it's what the new biosocial works in.
Yeah.
So how do that presumption that we are not now so I'm not saying that the old racially stratified society is the same, but it is definitely still stratified around those lines, okay?
Yes.
So it's the recognition of that fact, which I think of as a profound and important social fact from my perspective and from my values. I often encounter scientists who just simply won't acknowledge that fact.
Yeah.
We're just editing genes to make people smarter, and who wouldn't want their kids to be smarter?
Yeah.
So it's just so disassociated from but that's something that somebody could have had a conversation with Davenport, and he would have said, Davenport would have said, right half a block away, he would have said, yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I think we ought to have smarter children, especially smarter white children. That would be great. So you see, see what I'm saying? That there's an ethical set of practices going through both, and there's also a deep resistance in the current to acknowledgement of what the context is in which they continue to work.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And just again, to quote James Baldwin, they make the reality of racial stratification harder to reach, because not only do they not acknowledge it, but they're proposing theories of why we have these obvious gaps in welfare along racial lines and gender lines and lines of disability and class, all of that, that is actually because of genetic difference. So they're not only not acknowledging it, they're obscuring it as well, which is...
All right, I'm getting a 5-minute warning.
Yes, and that's what I called unethical, because it moves us away from justice rather than toward it.
Professor
Yeah.
Bobo.
Again, thank you, Dorothy, and for fantastic presentations. And I actually had a naive question, and Professor Hammonds has put 3/4 of what I was going to say on the table already, because that's kind of where I was headed. But I actually have a naive question for Dorothy and Steve, and it's just whether you would be optimistic about the prospects for a paradigm change that would save us from these dilemmas. You point to work like Krieger's that shows much greater sophistication in how it grapples with these issues. Dorothy's laid out the ethical problems with the routine practices of interpretation and framing of scientific work. And Steve started off on very much the same note, but given, and now I'll go back to Professor Hammonds, given what we know about entrenched inequalities of power, status, and resources, given what we also know about the power of the quick journalistic narrative for characterization of social problems, where a biological diagnosis will trump every other cognitively complicated sociological analysis of the problem. And given what we know, and this is really, I think, the point Evelyn was driving at, the power of deeply rooted common sense cultural frameworks that influence you whether you're a sociologist, an anthropologist, a biologist, a computational biologist, or whatever. Are you hopeful? Are you willing to prognosticate that we will get to the kind of paradigm shift, short of imposing a rule that says this kind of theoretical interpretation is ethically unwarranted, that gets this change to come about?
But that rule's not going to I mean, even the preface to your final point would say the last thing that's going to happen is that rule. That's
So
the last thing
we
that's
have to
gonna
be
happen.
careful about such rules because I think
Yeah.
your committee exists worrying about totalitarian governments to some degree, right? Deciding what science can and can't be done. To some degree, these other issues, broader. But you know, you should have invited Thomas Kuhn to this party as well, right? I'm very pessimistic because of the way entrenched patterns of scientific thinking occur, and I'm pessimistic about many things in the life sciences that have nothing to do with justice.
Yeah.
And I tried an experiment when I was NIMH director that was extremely unpopular, and I think it was ended when I left, which was to think not about coming up with a rule about what is ethical, because you know you could have a war between a neo-Kantian and a situational ethicist, but rather the rule was in human subjects research, in applied human subjects research, which I think this would count as. We would invite to the grant review study sections, you know, patients where it was a disease, or you know, parents and dealing with clinical trials of drugs in children, and one could imagine enforcing this on Dorothy, inviting Dorothy to every study section.
Please stop.
not to you know, not to talk about the merit of the precise statistical test, but is this an important question?
Yeah.
What have you missed? What the patients
Right.
told is really interesting. What the patients told us is it's really great, and that you have these efficient scales that measure symptom reduction. We don't care. What we would like you to measure is whether I will be able to go back to work or school, or whether my kid is going to do okay in school and have friends. But you know, because of the pressures of efficiency and history, we stuck with these symptom scales. I think it's even harder in these areas of justice. But I would suggest at least thinking about a role, again, not in judging the narrow technical merit, but the importance of the problem for federal funding, of when there are disadvantaged populations being studied, that there be a voice literally in the grant review. And again, it'd be very unpopular, but I think that does not interfere with academic freedom, right? It's simply a voice.
Right. Yeah, I think that's so important in order to question the underlying seemingly universal kinds of values that many scientists have in their studies, or in the very question of what's important to study. Again, gene editing shows this very clearly, that there's this idea that when you think about the ethics of it, this idea that, well, it will promote human flourishing. What is human flourishing? There's not a universal idea about it. But let me just say something also to Larry. The reason why you can see I'm very pessimistic, but why? No, I'm pessimistic. Well, look what I said it would take. Having black science fiction writers read by biosocial scientists. So, you know, I'm optimistic if that happens.
You have a temperamentally optimistic pessimist.
Exactly. But let me just say, the reason why, the thing though is that this research has such a great impact that I just don't think we can say, well, we're just going to let it go on. Believe me, I thought of that many times. Just let them do what they want to do. I'm going to work with, you know, activists on social justice. But what they're doing has an impact on the resources, the way that we can, even the thinking of people we want to galvanize, to agitate for more social justice. So I just don't think we can say that. To me, it's not a matter of being pessimistic or optimistic. If I was pessimistic, I wouldn't be doing, or if I wasn't optimistic, maybe foolishly optimistic, I wouldn't be doing any of the work I do. Any of it. You've got to have some hope. Otherwise, you
Yeah,
know, what do we,
we-
we're
so-
going to move to another
Sarah,
country.
with all due respect to your wonderful sign saying we're out of time, we have two hyper-patient people right here in the center, and I'm wondering whether you, sir, and then you, ma'am, could just ask your questions, and we'll see whether we can
Okay,
get it done. And I apologize to
My name is
everybody
Richard
else.
Cash. I'm at the Harvard School of Public Health. I work in infectious diseases and research ethics. I want to agree. My question is about the academy. I agree fully with Arthur that we do multidisciplinary. If we do that, we don't do interdisciplinary work. And I agree with you that we really need to solve problems, that's where it's at, and that we need to do much more in terms of international cooperation. I wonder, and you asked this question yesterday, is the academy the place to do this? Have we cut the bologna in such thin slices that we make it extremely difficult to collaborate, to work together, because every group has its own agenda? So that's the question I would like to ask.
Okay, and last question.
Naomi Sheeman, and this is coming from a philosophical direction, or critical, feminist, critical race theory. I find that the discussion's been going on the last, how long, about how deeply embedded ethics, morality, politics are in scientific practice, and the need to be explicit about that. I'm wondering whether you think that that situation, the need to recognize that and the resistance to recognizing that, is mirrored by a way of thinking about what causality is, and partly the dangers of scientism. That is, something becomes properly scientific when meaning is written out of the picture. And that, it seems to me, so deep to how science got established as a way of thinking about the world, is it's a meaning-free zone. And that's one of the reasons why I think Anne's example of essential hypertension was so striking, among other reasons, is that it shows that the causality operates through the meaning. And that you don't understand the causal mechanisms if you write the meaning out of it, if you write the politics out of it, if you write the morality out of it, you lose the causation. And for me, that's the deepest lesson of what social constructionism is about. I mean, it's why, and Anne's work is so exemplary in this, the sex-gender distinction broke down as a sharp distinction, where sex was, there's no meaning there. It's just these causal things. The meaning only comes in with gender. And that her work and others showed why that doesn't work. And to sort of, what if we began to try to wrap our minds around, as physicists like Karen Barad are trying to do, that maybe it's meaning all the way down. And that in order to do proper science, we don't have to write meaning, morality, significance out of the equation.
So two simple questions. Is the Academy superannuated because we went into the salami slicer long ago? And how does meaning engage causal mechanism?
But see, I think both the second point, I think, relates to the first, which is, and to Larry Bobo's question as well, which is that, yes, there are these profound problems with the very way we think, scientists think about how the world works. It's not just adding a different variable here or there. There are these deep problems with how meaning causes outcomes, rather than just the stripped down variables causing them. There are deep problems with even thinking in categories, not just certain categories like race and sex, but categories themselves. That the way to proceed to solve a problem is to put things in categories and then look at the differences between them. Which in our racially stratified society and patriarchal society and classist and ableist society, all ends up pathologizing people who are socially devalued. So those are really profound things that make it even harder to, to be even more optimistic. So, but the fact that you can say that, there are scientists working on other ways of thinking about this, that we could imagine a different kind of science. Shouldn't we be doing that? I mean, even if it seems impossible, we have to do that. Otherwise, and of course, we're not going to achieve it, but maybe 5 generations from now, if we start to get our students to think about this, if we engage with people
As long as it's not
outside the academy.
epigenetic.
Exactly. Well, that's the,
I think on that uplifting note.
I have to be optimistic about it. Otherwise, what are we
So thank you for conducting an amazing seminar in the weirdest setting in history. It was brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thanks.